Hello world, I'm Lily. Welcome to this video. I'm talking with Lizzie today about her recent jury duty experience, and
Mm.
I've never served on a jury before, so I'm kind of jealous.
This is the first time that I've ever been even called for jury duty, and it's always kind of been like a secret desire of mine to serve on a jury. Um, so it was quite an a exciting experience, and also a very educational one because I know a lot of people, especially me as a young person, didn't really know much about the legal system and like how it all kind of works. So it was just very interesting to see how the jury picking process works and then how you move to actually sitting on a jury and being in on a case or a trial. I don't know which one it is, or
mhm.
if those terms are different or whatever. But so it was very interesting because part of it was like I felt like I was in a movie.
Answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Like it was like I felt like I was in a movie, but I was watching all the boring parts that they normally skip in a movie.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I can kind of picture that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very
Cool.
interesting. Yeah, very interesting experience. I do think it should be something that everyone should do at least once in their life.
Mm, yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely, because it's such a foundational piece of our country and how things work in our country, and like these things happen all day long every day, and so it makes sense to, I don't know, I feel like we all need to be better acquainted with the justice system. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was interesting to me. So, kind of how the jury process works is normally you get a letter in the mail and it tells you you need to appear from this day to this day. And the
Mhm.
story was kind of funny because I had gotten one at the beginning of the year, but I had a scheduling conflict with the exact dates that they called me. Um, so you are able to either get excused from jury duty or me personally, I asked to just postpone it because I was like, I finally got called for jury duty. I was so excited. But then I was so bummed because I had a scheduling conflict. So I was able to get it postponed. Yeah, so I was finally able to come in for jury duty, and they called like 80 people. So yeah, there was like 80 of us, and they called us all in to a room, and then the judge and the lawyers called up like the first 20 people and started asking them questions, just kind of to gauge who who the people were, and they were asking about any biases that people might have towards the case that they were being considered being jury for.
Mhm.
So that's a very interesting process because you're in this room full of strangers and they start asking questions. The lawyers and the judges start asking questions that actually bring up some really personal stuff. Like they don't want to invade your privacy, but it's like they want to know that it's
This is a
like
safe space.
yeah, it's a safe space, but it's also like, if the case has something to do with like domestic violence or something, they want to know if you've had experience with domestic violence, or if will have a bias towards either party in the case, because that's the most interesting part of the jury process to me, I think, is trying to pick people who can set their biases aside, and like
Mm, yes.
um because everybody has biases. There is no such thing as being unbiased, but it is very interesting because like they want to know, are you related to either party in the case? Are you related to any of the judges? Are you related to any of the lawyers? Are you related to any of the witnesses? And
Mhm.
one question that I thought was super interesting is they ask, are you related to or know any of the fellow jurors in the room? That was an interesting
Yes.
question. You know, we're in a smaller community, so it was kind of like yeah, there was a couple people that like knew each other on the jury, and so then they were kind of
Mm,
asking like, well, if this person is on the jury with you, it like influence your decision, or would that make you uncomfortable? And I was like, oh yeah, that would be an interesting consideration I hadn't thought of. So yeah, it was
yeah.
definitely a very interesting process. And something that really struck me was kind of, and this is kind of like the reason why I was saying I think this is something that somebody should do at least once in their life, is kind of the attitude that a lot of people had toward it. Because like I know a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, I got jury duty. I hate this. Why me? And I thought it was very interesting because the very first day, like the very first morning when we came in and sat down, the staff of the jury played this video about like the history of jury duty and why it's such a privilege and an honor to be able to have a jury and serve on a jury. And like they were like, this is a very important position and we really appreciate you. And like over the whole experience, all of the staff were very like, thank you for your service, thank you for your time, we
Mm,
appreciate you. And like once the actual trial started and they actually had a full jury picked, we were kind of like top talent. Like it was weird because they would always be like that, we were the last ones to come into the courtroom and the case couldn't start without us being there. So everybody rose when we walked into the room and everybody had to stand when we left. And that was actually kind of funny. That was kind of
that
weird.
is pretty
Just
cool.
yeah. So I just thought that was interesting, like how the staff was treating us as jurors and even just prospective jurors.
Hmm.
They were very respectful and very like, thank you for being here, thank you for your service. And then a lot of people were like, why am I here? I hate being here. Like, why
Mm.
me? I hope I don't get picked. And I'm over here in the back
Oh.
like, I hope I get picked.
Did the people who seemed like they didn't want to be there, did they end up getting like not chosen?
For the most part, yeah, because during the jury questioning process, you are able to say like, "Hey, me as a juror, this is going to be an undue burden to be here to serve on a jury." Like there was a couple like moms or women who were like pregnant, so they were having like morning sickness, and then there was like a couple guys who were
Mm,
like, I can't be away from work. So like it seemed like if you can come up with a good enough excuse, you can get excused on the day,
hmm.
if you really, really want to. But
Hmm. Just broke my arm. Oof.
yeah, maybe. I don't
Um,
know.
yeah, I'm kind of
Maybe
being
that one
silly on
wouldn't
that one.
fly. But
Yeah, probably not. Yeah, that's really interesting going back to like how they were um just treating the jurors with a lot of respect. I think that's really cool because that sounds like the way that it should be. Like it's I don't know, court cases are not something to be taken lightly. And so and it's also a huge honor to be able to serve on a court case because like it just makes me think of one of the reasons why America um wanted independence from Britain. It's because the king was packing the juries full of biased people, or sometimes he wasn't
mm,
even giving people a hearing, or like he would manipulate the outcomes in his favor, and so it was just like they couldn't trust their justice system at all. So yeah, I think it's really
mm,
cool that we have a better justice system. And it like the quality of it, I think is completely dependent on the people who are like currently sitting in those seats. Like, yeah,
hmm
I don't know. I just
yeah.
think that's really cool.
Yeah, that was definitely that was definitely something that I feel like was impressed upon me, was that it's like when you serve on a jury, you could be thinking about like, oh, this is so cool. I'm sitting on a jury and I feel like I'm in a movie. But then like at the end of the day, it's like you're making decisions that affect somebody's life.
Hmm.
And there is definitely a soberness to it, that it's like, well, okay, if I make the wrong decision, I could be affecting this person's life in a wrong way, in a bad way. And so that was definitely an interesting experience. And, it just also, I don't know, I'm trying to put it into words, like it was hard, I think, hearing the case and like knowing the background of all the people involved, that it's like you want to have compassion, but then your job is that, okay, that's what I thought was super interesting about the jury, is the jury doesn't decide the sentence. The judge does. The jury's job is just to figure out if the defendant actually did what they were accused of. Because I remember thinking that it's like, well, okay, so I can decide if this person is guilty or not, and then in my brain, I was sitting there going like, but like, how do we decide like what his punishment will be?
Hmm.
Because you hear all the facts of the case, and you want to have compassion, and you're like, well, okay, so I can take this into account and this into account, but at the end of the day, it was kind of like, no, you got to set all that aside, and it's just my job as a juror to decide whether or not they did what they were accused of. And then it's up to the
Hmm.
judge to decide the sentence. And we as the jury isn't actually part of that. So that was definitely interesting, but it also kind of made me appreciate the like judges and more like what they do and the responsibility that they have on their shoulders.
Yeah, that is interesting. Let me think if I have any questions about what's been said so far.
I don't know if I'm like rambling and going into way too much detail.
No, it's all been very interesting.
You just want to
Um,
know more about the process of actually being picked as a juror?
no, I think you covered that pretty good. I guess my
Hmm.
next question is, how long did the case take? Like, how long were you serving?
I believe I served on the jury for like 3 days, because it was kind of like they took most of the morning to like pick the jury, and then after they picked us as the jury, then we kind of like spent the afternoon in the actual case. It was more like, all in all, the time that I spent in the case was probably more like 2 days, but it was spread across 3 days, because like there was a couple like half days kind of deal. And it was super nice that
Mhm.
they ended like around 3 or 4 o'clock, so we didn't like get held late. That was nice.
That's good. Did they say anything about like the average duration of a case, or does it vary pretty widely? It seems like it might, depending on the severity of it.
Yeah, it might depend on the severity. They did kind of, it does seem like they make time estimates dependent on the case.
Hmm.
So I was called for like a week of jury duty, and they actually had
Oh, okay.
two different cases that they pulled jury members from the same pool of 80 people. So I actually didn't get picked for the first case, and that went on for like 2 days, and then they called me back like in the middle of the week, and I got picked for the second case. So they did have a time estimate that they were, like the first case, they were like, okay, the first case is probably going to take like 2 days, and then the second case they were like, we're going to try and do it in 2 days, but it'll probably end up being more like three. So they had like a time estimate already in place, I think.
And well, let's see. I think you said that you're allowed to talk about the case now. Do you want to go into any of the details of the actual case?
I could. It was very, I'm trying to think here how I want to phrase this.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so the actual case itself, I probably won't go into like too much detail, just but the case that I was served jury for was a theft case. And it was weird because like we were looking at security footage and police body cam footage and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And it's weird when it's footage of places that you recognize. You know, where it's like, because it involved like a theft from Cabela's. And so it was like, oh, I've been in that Cabela's. I've been there. I know this place. And I thought it was interesting that that was the weirdest part of being a jury was within myself because they super stress that you have to be sure of your decision beyond a reasonable doubt. And
Hmm.
so as we were going through the case in my own brain, I was kind of like starting to realize that I have to like question everything. And like the lawyers had to prove everything. They were stressing that it's like, you know, they could be cut. So like they had to prove that the theft happened in Idaho, and that's why it was in an Idaho court. Um,
Oh.
and
Yeah, because
so
that
they were,
Cabela's on the state line.
yeah. So it was interesting that that was one of the questions they were asking us in the jury picking process because they were like, "So this involves Cabela's. Is there anybody here who like worked at Cabela's at once upon a time?" Or and then they asked, "Is there anyone here who hasn't been to Cabela's?" And like nobody in the room raised their hand. I was like, "Welcome to Idaho, everybody."
First thing you do when
Yeah.
you cross the border, you stop in at Cabela's.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting that it was like they just had to show us the footage and it was like, oh yeah, we've all been to Cabela's. We know that's the Idaho one.
Yeah.
Um, but you know, then in my brain I was sitting there going like, oh, they had to like prove that. Like I didn't think of that.
Mm.
Yeah, it was very interesting to watch the lawyers and how they like went about presenting their evidence and how they confirmed things. Like they had each of the witnesses come in and they would have to like say their full name for the record and like how they're related to the case. So there was a lot of like Cabela's workers and police officers.
Mm.
And then the prosecutors would ask each of the witnesses to identify the defendant in the room, which I thought was very interesting. That which I was like, oh, that could be interesting. That it's like you get a witness who was like, oh yeah, this person did this, but then they don't recognize the defendant like sitting in the room. So that was very interesting
Yeah.
that they did that for each of the witnesses, and you know, each of the witnesses were basically confirming each other's stories because they were all able to pick out the defendant in the room, which I thought that was interesting.
Were they in a different room while that was happening? Like, were they just bringing them in one at a time?
The witnesses?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I felt really
Mm.
bad for the witnesses because they called the witnesses, and I think the witnesses were there all day and they were just like out in the hall, not in the courtroom. And
Just
they just had to
chilling,
like, yeah, just chilling. And even if they weren't called that day, they still like had to be there because, you know,
just
we
in
didn't know,
case.
yeah, we didn't know how long questioning would be. And like, even after they were just like dismissed, some of them were dismissed, with the option to like recall them back in if they
Hmm.
wanted to.
Interesting.
Yeah. So like when I first got jury duty in my letter, like my letter arrived and it was like, you're gonna do jury duty, and I was like, I was asking my mom like all the questions, like please tell me everything. I want to be prepared. I don't want to do anything wrong. And it was kind of interesting because both neither of my parents have actually like they've gotten called up for jury duty, and my mom has been gone through like rounds of questioning before, but none of them I don't think have actually served on a jury. So it was kind of like new uncharted territory. And so I was a little bit nervous, like walking in, like I don't know what the rules are, but the staff of the courtroom, like this is what they do all day, every day. They deal with people who have no idea what they're doing. And so they have a
Yeah.
very clear system of explaining everything. Like they explain how you're supposed to think about all the evidence and what you can and cannot say.
Hmm.
They really explained everything like right at the beginning. Um, and that was really helpful. I was like, okay, they know what they're doing. They're telling me what I need to do. I feel a lot more confident. So,
Yeah,
if you have any fears about going into jury duty, don't be alarmed. They will tell you what you need to know, and you'll be fine.
that's good. I bet everyone or most people have probably never served before.
Yeah. Well, that was the other interesting question that they asked during like the jury picking process was like, have you served on a jury before?
Mm.
And what was your experience? And so like there was a couple people in there who were like, "Oh yeah, I've served on an actual jury like 4 times." And there was one guy who served on a grand jury, which I learned that a grand jury, I think it's a grand jury. So there's like state there's like state courts and then there's federal courts.
Hmm.
And those systems are not aligned. So they were saying that you can be called up for the state courts, and then when they call you up, they can't call you for like another 2 years. But the federal courts are on a different system, so technically you can be called by the state court and then the federal court in the same year, which I was like, oh, that's interesting. Did not know that.
That is interesting. You know, I
Hmm.
never thought about that 2-year thing before, but that's probably to make it so that people don't tamper with the case by calling up the same jurors every time or like tamper with your local justice system.
Yeah. Well, and it's also probably, because it is, they ask you for a week of your time, and that's time you have to take off of work.
That
And
too.
I know companies have to let you, like they have to give you that time off, but I'm not sure that they have to give you paid time off. So
Mm,
there
yeah.
was
And they
there
don't pay
was
you very much to be on the jury, right?
no, no, I think I got like $6 or something. I'll buy a
That's a whole
coffee.
oh my gosh.
They were very nice. They did get us donuts in the mornings and bought us lunch a few times. So
Well, hey, if
that
that's
was
not worth it.
nice. Don't be
Yeah,
alarmed. They will tell you everything you need to know.
I'm curious, do you feel like the innocent until proven guilty idea was carried throughout each step of the process?
Yeah, I would say so. Because uh, the way the case or the trial, I'm not sure it was. I'll call it the case because I don't know what the technical terms here.
Mhm.
How like kind of how it was run was the defendant doesn't act like the defendant isn't required to say anything or defend themselves against any of the evidence that the prosecutors are bringing up. Like the proof of guilt is entirely on the prosecutors. I believe that's the right term.
Yeah.
But the in this case, it was state lawyers. The state lawyers, they were the ones that had to prove that it happened in Idaho. They were the ones that had to prove that it was this guy in this place, and they were the ones that had to prove that these items were stolen, and they had to prove that he did it with that he walked into the store with the intent to steal. So yeah, that was very interesting. So there was like 3 or 4 different charges, and it was interesting that each of the charges, I didn't realize how specific charges can be. That they're like, oh, there's a difference between theft and grand theft, because there's like grand theft is when you steal something above a certain like dollar amount. And then there's like regular theft, which is like everything below that dollar amount. And then
Mm.
there's, like your charge will be different or less depending on if you walked into a store intending to rob it, or if you were just walking into a store and then you saw an opportunity and took it. Like the severity
Oh,
of the charge is different. Um,
interesting.
which is why I think this particular case came up, because me as a juror, I'm not going to speak for any of the other jurors. I felt like from the beginning that it was very clear, because there was a lot of security footage. Like it was pretty clear, like, no, it was this guy and this is how he stole the things. Oh, that was the other thing. Yeah, I think the specific point of contention, like the reason this case came up was because they were trying to lessen the charges against him.
Oh.
And so it seemed like a lot of the things that they were trying to highlight and prove was, did he walk out of the store with the items? So did he technically steal them because he never
Mm.
left the premises with the merchandise that he was trying to steal? Or could they say that he was able to scam people because they kind of like caught him at the checkout station, and so he was like midway through paying for it, but they
Mm.
didn't actually finish the transaction before the police came in. And so it was kind of like there was all these like technical
Oh.
things where it's like, well, he didn't actually finish the transaction and he never actually left.
An important note here.
Hmm.
You've mentioned to me that he was changing price tags, right?
Yes.
So like
Yeah.
he was
So
trying to pay for something, but he was trying to pay a lot less than what he was supposed to.
yeah, he was running kind of like a scam to be able to walk out with like you know, pieces of equipment that were like thousands of dollars, but at the checkout they rang up as like only a couple hundred. So that was interesting, that when we were, so kind of how the case works was the jury is, we sit through and we hear all the evidence, we hear all the witnesses, and then kind of after everything is all presented, then we go into deliberation. And um the interesting part was, so we had like, so there's like the courtroom, and then they, every time they took us out, we walked across a little hallway into our own like little green room, sitting room. It made me feel like an actor with, I need to go to my trailer kind of kind of feeling. It was slightly eerie because they locked the door, so that every we always had to, whenever we were in the building, we had to be escorted by the bailiff. So he would escort
Hmm.
us everywhere, and they every time there was like a break, they told us not to go out in, to keep us from like going out into the hallways where there was witnesses or other people for other cases. They were like, we can't have you talking to anybody. So we like had to go into a separate room, and they'd like lock us in.
Hmm.
And if we needed anything, there was like a bell and somebody would come. Um
That's
so
interesting.
yeah, it was like being oddly pampered, but also feeling slightly cooped up, because it was like, okay, we're all stuck in this room and we're locked in. We did have bathrooms in the room with us, so that was
Oh,
nice.
that's good. Well, what is the purpose of that? Is it just to like keep people from influencing you?
Yeah, it's to keep people from influencing us. I think also just to keep the details of the case private and secret. And it is mainly to not have any outside influences. Like they even told us to not look up the case or details about the case on our phone. We like don't even look up news about it. Like they
Oh
were just
yeah, I
like,
was wondering if they even let you keep your phones.
they did let us keep our phones until after the end of the case, and we went into our private green room, and then we had to deliberate and like come up with our decision. So that was the interesting part. So there was 13 of us jurors, and we were not allowed to talk about the case with each other until the very
How does
end.
how does that work?
It was very interesting because for a lot of the breaks and lunches and stuff, here I am in a room with 12 other strangers, and we can't talk about the one thing that we all have in common. So it was kind of weird because I felt like I got to get to know all the other people that I was on the jury with, because there were multiple times during this case where the judge and the lawyers had to have conversations that we weren't allowed to be present for, which was kind of a sore point for us jury, that like we'd be called in for like, we would arrive, and then we'd be like waiting in the back room for like half an hour to an hour, then they would call us in, and then we would like be in the case and in the courtroom for like 10 minutes, and then they're like, hold up, we need to talk about something, and then they would like take the jury out and we'd be waiting for like another hour. Which I understand, because it's for the same reason that they don't want the conversations between the judge and the lawyer to influence the decisions that we as the jury are making. But it still felt like this, okay, so there was a lot of waiting. There was a lot of waiting. And we were with the 12 other jury where it's like, well, we can't talk about the case. And we were allowed to take notes. They did give us like notepads and stuff to take notes, but we weren't allowed to show our notes to anyone or talk to anyone about the details. So that was actually kind of nerve-wracking for me, because I was like, I'm sitting here going like, well, these are my opinions, but I don't know the opinions of the other 12 people as well, and until we went into deliberation in at the end of the case. And then it was like we could talk about it all that we want, which like that moment was like kind of a relief, because it was like as soon as we started talking, it was like, oh good, everybody thinks the same thing as me, like I wasn't the only one who was thinking these things. But yeah, so it was kind of it was really interesting that it's like, okay, here are these 12 random people, and we kind of like really got to know each other a little bit at least. And like some people some of the guys were kind of laughing to themselves, because they're, what comes up is like their business and what they do. And so some of them were like making contacts and like passing around cards, and like they're like, well, I like, can I tell my company to pay me for this time, because I was technically doing business. That was interesting. I was also like the youngest one in the room, as always.
As per usual.
Per usual. Yeah, youngest one in the room. And it was the particular batch of jury that I was with there's only 3 girls out of 12. So that'd be like nine guys. And I felt so bad, because a jury is normally 12 people. But the reason we had a 13th man basically is he had to sit in on all of the jury, so that he would be up to date with everything. And his job was basically that if one of the other jurors, like for some reason got sick, got in an accident or whatever, couldn't make it, he would be there to like fill in their spot for the deliberation.
Oh,
but I felt so
the
bad
understudy.
because yeah, he was like basically the understudy. But I felt so bad that like, so he was like, he hung out with us and he was with us the whole time, and then when it came to deliberation, they were like, okay, just you can go home now. And like he wasn't able to share any of his thoughts. He wasn't like, I don't know if he ever figured out like what our decision was. Like he was just kind of left with, okay, I sat in on a case but had nothing to do with it. Like we all felt kind of bad for that gentleman.
Yeah.
So that was the interesting part. So we heard all the case, we heard all the witnesses. And then after that, they gave us another talk about like how we're supposed to consider evidence and how we're supposed to talk about things. And like that was the other, that we are just looking at each of the charges and saying, yes, I believe this person is guilty of this charge, or no, this person is not guilty of this charge. So that I could see how that would be very interesting, is if you're like, well, I think this person, did walk in with the intent to steal something, but that wasn't one of the charges. That's not up to us to decide whether or not he
to
did
like add
that.
it to the list.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Or I think in this particular case, what was it? Oh yeah, so in this particular case, one of the charges was a grand theft, I think. And then on the last day, the judge changed that charge to attempted grand theft, because he never actually left the building with the merchandise. And so I was thinking about, as we were deliberating, I had that thought, which was like, oh, if the charge had stayed grand theft, we as the jury probably should have said not guilty to the grand theft. Even though we believed he was trying to steal them, we would have to say no, not guilty to
Right.
grand theft because he didn't actually walk out of the building with it. Which I was like, oh, that could be hard as a jury member, where if you believe that the charge,
differentiate.
yeah. But I think that's what the whole case was to get a few of the charges like changed.
Right.
And so it did feel a little bit like, why is this case coming before us? It seems pretty obvious, like all the evidence that this guy did it. But then I realized over time, like, oh, it was because they were trying to get the charges changed a little bit so that they were a little bit more accurate to the situation, so that it was probably so that the sentence would be lessened.
Yes, that is interesting.
That was interesting. Yeah. So the deliberation part was kind of fun. That was more the fun part because they brought all of the evidence. They locked us in the room with all the evidence, and they took all of our phones and put them in a different locked box. Then we were able to deliberate, and they gave us all of the evidence, which I was glad because like they showed us the evidence in the trial, but like it was kind of like, here, everybody, look at this photo and set it down. I'm like, what? You know. So I was glad, we were able to look over the evidence a little bit more in depth, and like we were able to watch all the security footage and like go frame by frame and do all the things. It was a little interesting because part of the case was about drugs. And so part of the evidence was an actual baggie of drugs. And so we had specific instructions about how to handle how to handle drugs, but it was also like, oh, we're locked in a room with actual drugs. Okay, that's lovely. That's great. Yeah. So that was interesting. Yeah, the deliberation process was definitely the most interesting part because it was like just because it was like we wanted to have compassion for the defendant, like because they were talking about how he probably had a family and he was doing it because he needed money, and it felt like a really bad situation. Like it was just a bad situation for the defendant, and like that didn't mitigate though that he did actually break the law. And so we kind of like had to set compassion aside, but it was still also like kind of a little bit rough because it's like I understand that this guy felt like he had nowhere else to go, didn't have any other options, even though me personally, I personally think he probably did have other options, but he probably didn't feel like he did. And we didn't, me and one of the other women who was there, she was like a grandma, and so like she was just like, oh, I really feel for this poor guy. And I was kind of like, well, it's not like, that's not our job. Our job here is just to decide whether or not he's guilty. But we as jurors can still pray for this guy and hope that going to prison will set him on a different path, and that we here can decide, yes, he was guilty of doing these things, but have compassion in like praying for them, or
that's a good point.
That kind of deal. That just because you're deciding whether or not this person is guilty and you are sentencing, you basically are sentencing them to prison, you can still have compassion and still hope better for them. So I don't know if that would be different if it was like clear from the defendant that they weren't remorseful or whatever. I don't know. It was just that this particular case felt a little more rough because I don't think the defendant was like necessarily a bad person, if you will.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point because I don't know if like the store manager even has the authority to do this, but if you owned a store and someone was stealing from you, right then there is an opportunity to let them take it if you feel like they need it more than you do. But the fact that the store decided to press charges means that, they didn't want to let him get away with it. And then so the jury's duty at that point is to help the to help both of them, like to help the store, but then also the person, like to treat both of them fairly. Sounds like it was a very educational experience.
Indeed, indeed it was. I don't know, it was an interesting experience for me to think about myself and like my biases and how I think. And since I am a younger person, it was a little bit, I had the thoughts in my brain where it's like, well, what if I'm the only one who thinks a certain way? What if I am, because a jury decision has to be unanimous. We all agree. And so, there's like I don't like confrontation. And so, there's a slight part of me that was like, well, what if I have to defend my position and my thoughts? Or what if I have to debate with someone who doesn't agree? And then there's also like the element where it's like, well, I want to do the right thing because the decision that I make, impacts another person. And so I want to make sure that I'm making the right decision and like double checking myself of like, do I feel like it's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt? Am I fully convinced of this decision that I'm making? Thankfully for me, everybody kind of thought very similarly. We all were very much on the same page. So there wasn't any like tension or people having to um, defend their position. And anybody who was like bringing up questions, everybody was very courteous and wanting to have all the opinions heard. And like I was very blessed, I think, to be in a jury where I think everybody had that mindset that they're like, well, we want to do the right thing, we want to make sure that we consider everything, we don't want to just jump the gun. So even people who were questioning things were treated respectfully, and which I hope is the experience of everyone who's on a jury, but I know that sometimes probably doesn't, that probably doesn't happen all the time. So
Yeah, that's good to hear that you had a good experience. And it does make me like kind of wonder what courts look like across the country. Like when you hear about crazy cases that are happening,
mm,
um, it seems like we have a really good system, but again, it's the people who are running it who are going to determine how smoothly it actually runs or how honest the outcomes actually are. Like if you have a corrupt judge,
hmm
they can do
yeah,
a lot. And if you have a corrupt jury, they can do a lot of damage. And
yeah,
yeah, it's really interesting because I've been a poll worker for the last 2 elections, and I've been having the
mm-hmm.
same thoughts about that kind of thing where it's like, um, I'm really confident in the people who were working at the place that I was working at, but I can see how corruption can happen because it's people. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's just a very, very interesting thought. And it's cool to hear you describe all the different, like, kind of checks and balances that they have and different safeguards. And
hmm
it all sounds really cool.
yeah, it was definitely an interesting experience. And it also made me, I don't know, it just made me want to have more care and intention about the opinions that I make, because like you hear of random stuff, or out you hear in news or you hear of politics where it's like you immediately like, oh, that's illegal, they should go to jail for that. It's just like kind of that experience just kind of like made me want to be like, okay, slow down, actually think about things,
Yeah.
um and consider. And it also made me like more appreciative of like, how would I want a jury to think and react if I was a defendant in a case. If I was ever in court, hopefully that never happens. But if I was, if
Yeah.
I was in court, how would I want to be treated? And I'd want to be treated fairly. And I wouldn't want someone who was biased against me, but then in fairness, I wouldn't want someone who was biased for me, which that was interesting as well to consider. That it's like that was something that the lawyers were looking for as well, that they're like, it actually came up a lot about police credibility, that they were just kind of like asking like, so if you were, if a policeman was a witness in this case, would you be more likely to believe them or less likely to believe them? And
Mm.
that was interesting to consider as well. I think there was a lady who asked to be dismissed because part of the case was drugs. That she was like, I have a lot of experience with drugs and I know like the hold that they have on people. So I know that I would be biased to be more compassionate towards this
Mm.
person because I have so much experience with drugs. And so she asked to be excused. So like I thought that was interesting. When you're going in as a jury, you know, like they want to figure out who is the most in the middle. Like they're either that they're not either biased against, but they're not biased for as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, that was interesting. Food for thought. So don't be afraid of jury duty. It's a very interesting experience. It can be a little long, can be a little tedious, but maybe you'll make some new friends. Who knows?
Or some business contacts.
Or some business contacts. You never know. We were also laughing about um oh, what was it? Oh yeah, it was so we were like the first time we were just kind of like going around like just kind of like introducing ourselves, asking each other like, "Oh, you married? Do you have kids or whatever?" You know, we got to me and I'm like 10 years I'm like 10 years younger than everybody, you know, in the room, you know, cuz like a lot of them were like, "Oh, I'm a grandma or I'm a grandpa." And then there was a lot of like young dads who were like, "Oh yeah, I have like two kids and they're not older than 5." You know, then we got to me and I'm like, "I'm not married. I don't have any kids." And the like grandma lady was like, "Oh, well, maybe I can help you find a man." You know? And like the room bursted with like, "Well, not in here, right?" And you know, and they were so and she was like, "Oh no, not from in here." But like they were all kind of laughing like, "Oh, well, I don't know. Could you might meet your
Maybe out
future
in the
spouse."
courtroom.
Maybe out in the courtroom. Yeah. So I was like, I was like, oh, I was laughing to myself. Like I could see that. I just see that now, like a Hallmark movie. Like I met my future spouse on jury duty.
Oh yes. What would you call that? Um, Legally in love. That's what you call it.
Oh. Mm.
I want to think of more names for that Hallmark movie, but probably don't have to do that right now.
No. Mhm.
That's cool. Well,
Yeah.
do you feel like you covered everything you wanted to cover? I thought this was very interesting.
I think I did. I can't really think of anything. Are you excited now, Lily, for the time when you get to serve on a jury?
Oh yes, very much. Yeah, I it's funny because my mom and my sister have received jury summons before, and I'm just sitting over here like, come on, when's it gonna be my time? Yeah, I think the law is very interesting. So, yeah, I'm definitely excited for that time. I think this has been a very successful discussion, and we hope that all of you watching have enjoyed it as well, because
Mhm.
that is so important to us.
Yeah, well, thanks for interviewing me and giving me some good questions.
Sure thing. All right.